Greetings. As it is now late December, it's time for crude polemics against Christmas to once again proliferate on social media. And one of the more popular of the forms of those polemics is an attempt to reduce the Feast of the Nativity, Christmas, to little more than some sort of repackaged Saturnalia based on alleged or, at best, superficial similarities in some of the folk practices. Now, over the years, when I've attempted to discuss this polemic with others, I've noted that to me, Saturnalia seems more like Hanukkah than it does to Christmas. And a lot of people find that absurd at first. But in this video, I'd like to explore that a bit, and as we're currently at the beginning of Hanukkah, it's now the second night of Hanukkah, it seemed like an auspicious time to make this quick video in which I'd like to discuss some similarities between Hanukkah and Saturnalia, as well as some interesting bits of trivia. However, let me put up the disclaimer that just as I see the alleged similarities between Christmas and Saturnalia to be superficial, so too I acknowledge that the similarities between Hanukkah and Saturnalia are likewise somewhat superficial. This video is not a polemic against Hanukkah. Rather, it's merely part of a thought experiment. So please don't think that this video is arguing something like Hanukkah, is merely some sort of, copied Saturnalia or anything like that. This is more intended to share some interesting information in a lighthearted and fun way. But with that, let's jump right in, and we'll begin by turning to the Oxford Encyclopedia of Ancient Greece and Rome. And we're going to turn to page 221, where we find the entry on Saturn. And in this case, it's referring to the deity, Saturn. And when you go to the second paragraph of that entry, you find the following, quote, Saturn's festival, the Saturnalia, properly the 17th of December, the best of days, as per Catullus, as well as the dedication day of Saturn's temple, was Rome's most beloved and merry, end quote. Now, the most significant part of that is the fact that Saturnalia celebrated the dedication of the temple of Saturn. For those who don't know, Hanukkah celebrates the dedication of the temple in Jerusalem. In fact, the word Hanukkah itself means dedication or consecration, right? And to add a little ancient support to that entry in the Oxford Encyclopedia of Ancient Greece and Rome, I'm going to turn to Livy's History of Rome. Now, this is specifically from the first volume of Benjamin Oliver Foster's 1939 translation of Livy's History of Rome for the Loeb Classical Library, and I'll list all of my sources in the video description. So, roughly 2,000 years ago, at around the dawn of the Common Era, Livy wrote the following, Ede Saturno dedicata, Saturnalia institutus festus dies. The English translation of that is, the temple of Saturn was dedicated, and the days of the feast of Saturnalia were instituted. And we find something similar in Macrobius's Saturnalia. It's worth mentioning, by the way, that some of the claims which float around the internet about what allegedly happened during Saturnalia don't seem to trace back farther than the 19th century. Like, really, some of these claims don't have any sources that are earlier than the 19th century. Therefore, I want to say that if one is attempting to determine what happened during Saturnalia in ancient times, it might be helpful to actually turn to ancient sources, like Macrobius's Saturnalia, but you don't have to limit yourself to that source. And here we have the first volume of Robert Kaster's 2011 translation of Macrobius's work, which he did for the Loeb Classical Library. So turning to pages 84 and 85 of that work, or more specifically, Book 1, Chapter 8 of Macrobius's Saturnalia, what we find is that Macrobius notes two competing traditions regarding which king of Rome established the temple of Saturn. But in either case, Macrobius makes clear that Saturnalia was connected to the consecration or dedication of that temple. Now, the point here is that, as was noted in the Oxford Encyclopedia of Ancient Greece and Rome, and so too in Livy, Saturnalia was a celebration of the dedication of the temple of Saturn. Similar to Hanukkah, it was a celebration of the dedication of a temple. And while we're in Macrobius' Saturnalia, I'd like to touch on another aspect of the feast by turning back a few pages to the 7th chapter of Book 1, more specifically pages 80 and 81 of Kaster's translation. Macrobius relates that there was an oracle about the appropriate ritual for the Saturnalia, which vaguely said in Greek, "To patri pempete phota," send phota to the father. As Macrobius notes, phota could be interpreted as man or as light, right? So it can mean send man or send a man or men to the father or send light to the father. And unfortunately, some horrifically thought that this entailed human sacrifice. But mercifully, thankfully, the more humane interpretation of phota meaning light ultimately won out, at which point Macrobius adds, quote, hence the custom of exchanging candles during Saturnalia, end quote. On the following page, Macrobius gives a different tradition, writing, quote, others think candles are exchanged precisely because it was under Saturn's guidance that we passed out from a dark and uncultured way of life to the light cast by the knowledge of beneficial skills, end quote. Now, I showed all that to make this point. As I noted just a moment ago, in Macrobius' time, there were competing legends about who precisely established the Temple of Saturn. But either way, the Saturnalia was celebrated it was celebrating the dedication or consecration of that temple. So too, there were competing legends about why candles were so central to Saturnalia. But either way, candles were a significant part of the celebration of Saturnalia. So we might put it this way. The origins of Saturnalia were so old that even ancient writers were unsure of the precise explanations for its central elements. But it was nonetheless the case that ancient writers knew that Saturnalia celebrated the dedication or consecration of a temple, and they knew it had candles as a significant part of that celebration. Now, I'd like to quickly jump over to Book 3, Chapter 4 of Macrobius' Saturnalia, and that appears in the second volume of Robert Kaster's translation. And unfortunately, I do not yet own a hard copy of Volume 2. I only have the first volume in hard copy, so for Volume 2, I have to turn to an electronic version. And this is from page 26 of the second volume, and it is there that Macrobius writes, locum in quo figerent candelam, candelabrum appelletum, which means the place in which candles are fastened is called the candelabrum. So not only were candles a significant part of Saturnalia, but they were kept in a candelabrum, which is to say a branched candlestick which held multiple candles simultaneously, essentially something like a menorah. And to have a bit of fun with this idea, let's turn to the Hebrew text of Exodus 25:31, where we find an instance of the Hebrew word menorah. I wanted to show this because if we turn to the Vulgate, the Latin translation, the ancient Latin translation of the Bible, we can go to Exodus chapter 25, and what we find in verse 31 is the word candelabrum, precisely where menorah appeared in the Hebrew text. And we could also turn to 1 Maccabees, which covers the story of Hanukkah. Now, to my knowledge, there's no ancient Hebrew text of 1 Maccabees, but we can turn to the ancient Syrian Aramaic translation in the Peshitta. So you see here, Sifra de Maccabea, Aleph, the first book of Maccabees, and turning to verse 21 in the first chapter, you find the word manara, the Syriac equivalent of the Hebrew word menorah. And if one wants to see a Hebrew version of 1 Maccabees, I suppose I could show that menorah appears in a modern translation. And then we can jump over again to the Latin text of the Vulgate. Once again, one finds the word candelabrum precisely where the Syriac text and the modern Hebrew translation had manara or menorah, right? And the point I wanted to make is that since antiquity, the Latin word candelabrum was understood to be an acceptable Latin translation for menorah. So when Macrobius talks about candles being placed in a candelabrum, he's essentially describing a parallel to the menorah, more or less. And now, in the last segment of this video, perhaps this will be the longest, I'd like to turn to something I find particularly interesting, and that's an ancient text capturing the ancient Pharisaical perception of Saturnalia. So we will be looking at the Babylonian Talmud, tractate Avodah Zarah, page or daf 8a. So starting with the Mishnah portion on that page, we find this line, Elu edehen shel obde kochabim kalenda was Saturnura, These are the festivals or feasts, literally the Eids. Although it starts with an aleph rather than an ayin, the word for feast here is related to the Arabic word Eid. But anyway, it says, these are the feasts of the star worshippers, or more figuratively, the pagans. In short, the Mishnah is listing some pagan feasts. And the first two feasts that it mentions are Kalenda and Saturnura. That second one, Saturnura, is in reference to Saturnalia. And that alternative rendering of the name is itself potentially significant, and I'll return to it briefly at the end of this video. But for now, I'd like to jump to the Gemara portion, which elaborates further. And it begins as follows. Amar Rab Hanan bar Rabbah. Rabbi Hanan bar Rabbah said the following. Saturnura shmona yamim lifnei tekufa. Saturnalia is 8 days before the solstice, right? Wesimanach. Ahor wekedim sartani. And here is your sign, or a way for you to remember this. Behind and before, you have hemmed me in. And here, the relevant sage is actually quoting the 139th Psalm, specifically Psalm 139:5. And the straightforward explanation is that the text is merely using this verse to help, the reader remember that one feast comes before the solstice, that's Saturnalia, and one comes after it, that's Kalenda, right? But I imagine that some modern minds might still find it curious that the text toes the line of having within the layers of meaning of the 139th Psalm some sort of aspect which is somehow relevant to Saturnalia, right? That's at least potentially interesting. But moving on from that, the text continues. Tanu Rabbanan, our rabbis taught, and that Tav Reish at the start with what looks like a quotation mark between them, that's the Gershayim, that's an acronym, Tav Reish, for Tanu Rabbanan, our rabbis taught. And then it continues, Lefi she'ra'a Adam harishon yom shemitma'et vecholek. As per them, that the first man, i.e. Adam, saw that the day was diminishing and going, or to put it another way, he saw that the day was continuously diminishing. Amar oy li, he said, or Adam said, woe to me, right? And oy li, woe to me. Shema bishbil she sarachti, perhaps on account of me having sinned. Now, sarachti literally means I decayed or I developed a stench, but more figuratively it means I have sinned. So Adam was musing, perhaps because I sinned, and then he continues, Olam chashuk ba'adi, the world is darkening because of me. Wechozer letohu wabohu, it is returning to the formless primordial state, and so it's returning to tohu wabohu. And those words, tohu wabohu, are employed in Genesis 1:2 when it says that the earth was formless and void, right? So as Adam watched the days get shorter, he thought that the world was regressing back to that formless state. And so Adam continues, Wezohi mita nasa alimi hashamayim, and this is the death which has been decreed upon me as a penalty from the heavens. And then it continues, Amad yashab shmona yamim beta'anit, and he stood and he sat 8 days in fasting. And then it continues, Kewan shera'a tekufa tevet, but then he saw the turn in the month of Tevet, which is to say he saw the winter solstice. Wera'a yom she ma'arich vecholech, and he saw that the day was extending and going. It was continuously extending. Amar, he said, minhago shel olamhu, he said, this is a custom of the world. Halach ve'asa shmona yamim tobim, and he went and made 8 good days, or more figuratively, he established an 8-day celebration, an 8-day festivity. Leshana ha'acheret asa'an lelu ulelu yamim tobim, and to the next year, these and those were established as festive days, right? So he established it as a continuous 8-day celebration. And then there's this particularly interesting line. Hu kaba'am leshem shamayim, wehem kaba'um leshem Avodah Zarah. He established them, or he established those festive days in the name of heaven, but they established them in the name of their idolatrous worship. So the strong implication of this text is that Saturnalia was originally established by Adam, by the first man, and then later on it was corrupted by idolaters, right? That's what this text implies. Now, to be clear, I'm not saying that you have to believe the Talmudic claim on this, right? But even if it's a fiction, and we're all free, I myself am pretty skeptical, but we're all free to, be skeptical and think this might be a fiction. But even if it's a fiction, it would raise an interesting question. Why would the ancient Jewish sages, the ancient Pharisaical sages quoted in the Talmud, why would they concoct such a fiction, right? And before I propose a possible answer, it's also worth noting that the text understood Saturnalia to be 8 days. Now, among the Romans, the number of days that Saturnalia lasted actually fluctuated. When you look at the different ancient sources, you see that at one point it was 4 days, at another point it was 5 days, and at still another point it was 7 days, right? Now, for Talmudic sages to think that it was once 8 days opens the door to the possibility that it might have had that length as well. Like there might have been a period where Saturnalia was 8 days, right? And at least this is what these Talmudic sages, they were under the impression that it was 8 days at a certain point. Now, here's a crazy idea. Perhaps the reason the Pharisaical sages came up with a story about Adam creating Saturnalia was because this sometimes 8-day feast near the winter solstice, which celebrated the dedication of a temple and had candles and a branched candlestick as one of its major features, perhaps that feast reminded them of one of their own feasts, right? Is that at least possible? Now, admittedly, that's just a shot in the dark bit of speculation on my part, but whatever the truth of the matter is, at the very least, it's very interesting to juxtapose the similarities between Saturnalia and Hanukkah with an ancient Jewish tradition that Saturnalia was a once righteous Adamic feast that was later corrupted. And by the way, this isn't like entirely absurd, this idea that there would be Jewish feasts and Roman feasts that would be parallels. As I've mentioned in previous videos, there's a parallel between Pesach, between the Passover and the Ides of March. Before the calendrical reforms of Julius Caesar, which turned the calendar solar, the Ides of March would fall on the full moon of the first lunar month of the spring, and they would sacrifice a sheep and all this. It was similar to Passover. It would fall at roughly at the same time as Passover, and it was somewhat similar. So just as Passover and the Ides of March can be similar, so too there can be some similarities between Hanukkah and Saturnalia. Now, before I close, I said a little while ago that I'd share a brief note on the alternative name in this Talmudic text, right? Saturnalia is called Setarnura. Now, rather than that being a mere clumsy transliteration, the term can be seen as having a subtle meaning. It can be seen as combining two Aramaic words, setar, which means side, and nura, which means fire, the side of the fire, or the fireside. And you can interpret that in a variety of ways. Like here's one, admittedly highly speculative idea, but as Saturnalia falls on the side of the days which are approaching the winter solstice, the days which are diminishing, a time when it's very dark and it's helpful to light fires, hence that could be the side of the fire, the side in which you light fires to, for whatever reason, to cheer people up, to keep visibility, whatever the case, to fight depression, I don't know. But that aside, that bit of speculation aside, it's also interesting to note that the word setar appears in the ancient Aramaic translations of Exodus in precisely the locations which are discussing the structure of the menorah. You see, when Exodus 25:32 refers to the branches on each side of the menorah, Targum Onkelos has misitraha, literally from its side, from its setar. And the word actually appears twice in this verse. And so too in the Peshitta, the ancient Syrian Aramaic translation or Syriac translation of the verse, the term can be found. And you see here, misitre, from its side. And so too in this translation, the word appears twice. So that's a bit interesting. That, it's interesting that a term used in ancient Aramaic translations of Exodus to refer to the side of the menorah might be seen as embedded within the Talmud's curious reference to Saturnalia. But of course, I want to concede that this could all be attributed to coincidence as well as to the mind's ability to make connections which might not be intentional. Hence why I said that this video was intended lightheartedly as a fun thought experiment. Now, at the very least, I hope you found this interesting and entertaining. And as always, I look forward to any comments you might share. And with that, I close by saying Happy Hanukkah and God bless.
Una candelica, dos candelicas, tres candelicas, cuatro candelicas.